History is filled with stories, buried in unmarked graves, their truths left to the whisper of the wind across the plains. Today, we unearth one such story from the blood-soaked soil of the Arizona Territory, a story that begins not with the roar of a six-shooter, but with a terrifyingly intimate whisper. It's the story of a lone widow, a desperate Apache warrior, and a secret that bled into the soil between them. It asks a question few of us are prepared to answer when survival is all that's left. What lines are you willing to cross? What would you do if a man your people considered a demon looked into your soul and spoke the 5 words that would change your life forever? I can smell your fertile. The year of our Lord, 1878, tasted of dust. For Alaric Hayes, it was a flavor she knew intimately. It coated the back of her throat when the wind swept down from the Dragoon Mountains. It settled in a fine red film on the water in the bucket, and it clung to the black mourning dress she had long since stopped caring about. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 10 months, taken by a fever that had burned through him faster than a brush fire. He had left her with 2 things: a 40-acre plot of unforgiving land that the government called a homestead, and their 6-year-old son Samuel. The homestead was less a farm and more a monument to failed ambition. The well was temperamental, the creek bed was bone dry 9 months of the year, and the sun was a merciless hammer that beat the life out of everything, including hope. They were poor, a fact Alaric felt deep in her bones in the dull ache of hunger and the constant wearying calculus of survival. How many bullets left? How much flour in the sack? How long until the sun-dried jerky ran out on this particular Tuesday? The heat was a physical presence shimmering above the baked earth. Alaric was near the stubborn line of rocks at the edge of her property, trying to pry one loose to finish the pathetic wall around her chicken coop. Her hands, once soft and suited for needlepoint in her life back in Ohio, were now calloused and raw. Sweat stung her eyes and plastered her thin brown hair to her forehead. Samuel was inside the small, sweltering cabin, tracing letters in a book his father had cherished. She didn't hear him approach. The Apache moved with the silence of a shadow, a skill born from generations of hunting and being hunted. One moment she was alone, with the drone of insects and the scrape of her shovel against stone. The next, a shadow fell over her. Alaric froze, every muscle in her body locking tight. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't dare turn. The rifle, her husband's heavy Winchester, was leaning against the cabin wall a lifetime away. She could smell him. It was a scent of horse sweat sagebrush, and something else, something wild and unsettlingly clean, like the air after a lightning strike. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, she straightened up and turned. He was tall for an Apache, lean, and hard as the land itself. His body was a tapestry of scars and sun-darkened skin corded with muscle. He wore only a breechcloth and worn leather moccasins. His black hair was held back by a simple band, and his face was stark, a collection of sharp angles and unforgiving lines. But it was his eyes that stole her breath. They were not the wild, hate-filled eyes the dime novels described. They were dark, deep, and unnervingly still, like obsidian chips that reflected everything and revealed nothing. He held no weapon in his hands, but she knew he was more dangerous than any man with a gun. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. This was it. The stories she'd heard whispered in the nearby town of redemption, of raids of women, taken of unspeakable violence, they all coalesced into this single terrifying moment. She thought of Samuel alone in the cabin. A primal protective instinct surged through her, a fire that burned away the edges of her terror. She would die here, on this worthless patch of dirt before she let him be harmed. They stood in silence for what felt like an eternity. The sun beat down. A hawk circled high overhead. He simply watched her, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. His eyes roamed over her, not with lust, but with an unnerving, analytical scrutiny. He looked at her work-hardened hands, the slimness of her waist, the weary but resilient set of her jaw. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low whisper, raspy from disuse. The English words carefully formed, but heavily accented. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the cold finality of a death sentence. He took one step closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His nostrils flared slightly, a barely perceptible movement. "I can smell your fertile," the cold Apache whispered to the poor woman. The words didn't register at first. They were so bizarre, so intimate, so utterly alien to the violence she had been steeling herself for. And then they landed a seed of pure horror in her soul. It was worse than a threat of death. It was a claim. It was a pronouncement that delved past her skin, past her grief, and into the very core of her womanhood, branding her with a purpose she didn't want. The world tilted the heat and the dust and the fear, swirling into a suffocating vortex. Alaric Hayes looked into the eyes of the savage who had just named her, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt a terror so profound it eclipsed grief itself. The Apache did not move. He simply held her gaze, waiting for her to break. But something inside Alaric, some stubborn, mule-headed part of her that Thomas had both loved and cursed, refused to crumble. She held his stare, her chin trembling but unbowed. She was a cornered animal, and she would show no weakness. After another long moment, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of agreement or reassurance. It was an acknowledgement, as if he had found what he was looking for. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he turned and melted back into the landscape of rock and creosote bush. He didn't run. He simply ceased to be there. Alaric stood paralyzed, her shovel still clutched in her white-knuckled grip. The silence he left behind was louder than his presence. She finally gasped for air, her lungs burning. She dropped the shovel and scrambled for the cabin, her legs unsteady. She burst through the door, slamming it shut and throwing the heavy wooden bar across it. Samuel looked up, his blue eyes wide with alarm. "Mama!" "What is it?" "Nothing, sweet boy. Just a coyote." She lied, her voice a ragged whisper. She sank to the floor, her back against the door, and pulled her son into her arms, burying her face in his soft hair. He was all she had. The Apache's words echoed in her mind, obscene and terrifying. Fertile. He had looked at her not as a person, but as livestock, as breeding stock. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Alaric made a decision. She couldn't stay here alone. She couldn't protect Samuel. She needed help, leaving a small portion of their precious water and some jerky for Samuel. She locked him inside the cabin with a stern warning not to open the door for anyone, and set out on the 5-mile walk to the town of Redemption. Redemption was a name born of irony. It was a dusty, sun-bleached collection of clapboard buildings huddled together, as if for protection against the vast, indifferent emptiness of the territory. It had a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a sheriff's office. It was a place where hope came to die. When Alaric stumbled into town, covered in dust and wild-eyed with fear, she drew stares. The women in their cleaner dresses looked down on her, as that poor Hayes widow, a cautionary tale of what happened when you tried to tame a land that refused to be tamed. The men looked at her with a mixture of pity and a crude, fleeting interest. She went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller was a man whose ambition had long been baked out of him by the Arizona sun. He was paunchy with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much trouble to be interested in finding more. He listened to her story with a weary patience, leaning back in his creaking chair. "An Apache, you say," he drawled, picking at his teeth with a splinter of wood. "Just standing there. He spoke to me." Alaric insisted, her voice trembling with the effort of holding it together. He said something awful." She couldn't bring herself to repeat the words. It felt too shameful, too private. "He was watching me, sizing me up." Sheriff Miller sighed a long, gusty sound of exasperation. "Ma'am, the Chiricahua are restless, it's true. But they're mostly keeping to the mountains since the army pushed them back. You sure it wasn't just a drifter? Maybe a Mexican? I know what an Apache looks like. Sheriff!" She snapped, her fear turning to an anger. "He was right there, on my land. My boy was in the cabin. And he did what? Touched you, threatened you with a weapon. No but. So a native man stood on your property, said a few words you didn't like, and then left." Miller summarized his tone, dismissive. "Mrs. Hayes, with all due respect, I've got 3 men in my cell for a brawl at the saloon, a cattle rustling complaint from Silas Croft's ranch, and a payroll wagon coming through on Friday. I can't spare a deputy to go chasing after shadows, because a lone woman got spooked." "He wasn't a shadow," Alaric cried, slamming her hand on his cluttered desk. "He was real. Look!" The sheriff said, his patience gone. "You're out there all alone. It's not safe. Maybe you should consider selling that plot. Mr. Croft has been saying he'd take it off your hands. He'd give you a fair price, enough to get you and the boy back east where you belong." Her heart sank. Silas Croft, the wealthiest man in the county. His vast cattle ranch bordered her small property. He'd made offers before through his smirking foreman. Thomas had always refused. "This land has a deep well, Abby," he'd said. "Water is life out here. Croft wanted her water. She knew it. And now the sheriff was his mouthpiece. There was no help here." Defeated, she left the office, the accusing stares of the townspeople following her. She stopped at the general store to spend her last few coins on a small bag of flour. The owner, a grim-faced man named Peterson, barely met her eyes. The news of her visit to the sheriff had already spread. She was a hysterical woman, seeing ghosts. As she was leaving, a man stepped into her path, blocking the doorway. It was Silas Croft himself. He was a handsome man in a tailored coat, his face smooth, and his mustache neatly trimmed. But his eyes were cold and calculating like a snake's. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice a rich baritone that dripped with false concern. He tipped his hat. "I heard you had a bit of a fright," the sheriff told me. "It was not a fright, Mr. Croft," Alaric said, her voice tight. "Of course not," he placated, holding up his hands. "But you must see, this land is no place for a woman and child alone. It's dangerous. The savages are like wolves. They prey on the weak. I am renewing my offer for your land, for your safety, for your sons." His offer was an insult, barely a quarter of what the land and its water was worth. It was a threat veiled as concern. He was the vulture, circling, waiting for the land to kill her so he could pick the bones. "My husband worked this land, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice shaking with a quiet rage. "We bled for it. It is not for sale." Croft's smile tightened. The charm vanished from his eyes, replaced by a flicker of ice. "A foolish sentiment. Pride is a luxury the poor cannot afford. You will remember my offer when you're staring into the darkness one night, wondering which shadow holds a knife. Good day to you, Mum." He tipped his hat again and strode away, leaving Alaric standing in the harsh sunlight. She was utterly alone. The law wouldn't help her. Her neighbors wouldn't help her. She was caught between a predator who whispered obscenities in her ear and another who wore a fine coat and spoke in honeyed threats. The long walk back to the homestead was a walk of despair. Redemption had offered her none. The days that followed were a torment of watchful anxiety. Every creak of the cabin floorboards, every rustle of leaves in the wind sent a jolt of fear through Alaric. She kept the Winchester close at all times, even while she slept, her hand resting on its cold wooden stock. She made Samuel stay within sight of the cabin, a restriction he chafed under, but obeyed, sensing the new sharp edge to his mother's fear. She expected the Apache to return in the night. She imagined him bursting through the door, his dark eyes filled with violent purpose. But he did not come. The nights remained quiet, filled only with the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a lone coyote. On the fourth morning, after her trip to Redemption, she opened the cabin door to a surprise. Lying on the flat stone that served as a step was a dead rabbit, cleanly dispatched, its neck broken. There were no tracks around it, save for her own. It was simply there. Her first instinct was revulsion and fear. It was a message, a sign that he could get this close whenever he pleased, that the locked door was no barrier to him. She almost kicked the carcass into the bushes, but the gnawing hunger in her belly stopped her. It had been weeks since they'd had fresh meat. Thomas had been the hunter. Her own skills with the rifle were mediocre at best. With trembling hands, she took the rabbit. That evening, she and Samuel ate rabbit stew, a thick, savory meal that was the most satisfying they'd had in months. As she ate, Alaric was consumed by a confusing mix of gratitude and terror. Was it a gift, or was it a way of fattening the livestock? 2 days later, it happened again. This time it was a brace of quail left in the same spot. The day after that, a small leather pouch filled with dried, bitter-smelling herbs. She didn't know what they were for, but she recognized them as medicinal from a book her mother had owned. He was providing for her. The thought was so absurd, so contrary to every story she'd ever heard, that she couldn't fully process it. This was not the behavior of a bloodthirsty savage bent on murder and violation. This was something else, something she had no name for. She began to feel his presence, even when she couldn't see him. She would be tending her meager garden, and the hairs on the back of her neck would stand up. She would scan the rocky ridge that overlooked her property and see nothing but shimmering heat. Yet she knew he was there, watching from the shadows, his obsidian eyes following her every move. The fear was still there, a constant low hum beneath the surface, but it was changing. It was becoming less about imminent violence and more about the unnerving mystery of his intentions. One afternoon, the rickety fence around her chicken coop finally gave way. The handful of scrawny chickens she owned scattered, clucking in alarm. With a sigh of frustration, Alaric set about trying to fix it. The fence post was rotted at the base, and she lacked the strength to dig a new hole and set it properly. After an hour of fruitless struggle, she sat down in the dirt, wiping her brow, tears of sheer exhaustion and hopelessness welling in her eyes. A small pebble landed in the dust beside her. She looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. He was standing 20 yards away at the edge of the scrub brush. He was as still as a statue, simply watching her. This time she didn't feel the same spike of terror. It was a weary resignation. She stared at him, her chest rising and falling. She was too tired to run, too tired to scream. "What do you want?" She whispered the words, lost in the vastness. He didn't answer. He walked forward, his movements fluid and economical. He stopped at the broken fence and looked down at the rotted post, then at her feeble attempts to fix it. His expression was unreadable. He then looked at her, his gaze holding hers for a long moment. Finally, he pointed a single long finger at the broken fence, then at the rising sun, then back at the fence. The message was clear. Tomorrow, I will fix it. Then he turned and was gone. Alaric didn't sleep that night. She sat in a chair by the window, the Winchester across her lap, watching the moonlit landscape. She was caught in a whirlwind of confusion. The people in Redemption had dismissed her. Silas Croft wanted to ruin her, and the savage she was supposed to fear was leaving her food and offering to mend her fence. The world had turned upside down. True to his unspoken word, when she looked out the next morning, the fence post was fixed. A new sturdy length of mesquite had been sunk deep into the earth, the fence wire stretched tight and secured. The work was expertly done, far better than anything she or Thomas could have managed. Later that day, as she drew water from the well, she saw him again, sitting on a rock high up on the ridge. He was too far away to be a threat, but close enough to be seen. He was just watching. It dawned on her then that this wasn't a prelude to an attack. It was an observation, a long, patient, and deeply unsettling assessment. He was not a monster. He was a man with a purpose, and to her growing dread and confusion, she was beginning to realize that she was at the very center of it. An unspoken truce had formed between them, a fragile, terrifying peace in the heart of the wilderness, and Alaric had no idea where it was leading. The strange, silent courtship of survival continued for another week. A small pile of firewood appeared by her door. A patch of wild onions was left on her step. Alaric accepted these offerings with a sense of numb disbelief. She and the Apache, whom she had started thinking of simply as the Watcher, existed in a state of suspended conflict. She still feared him, but the fear was now a complex thing, tangled with a thread of reluctant dependency. He was the most dangerous man she had ever met, and he was the only reason she and Samuel weren't starving. The fragile peace was shattered on a scorching afternoon. A hot wind blew from the south, carrying with it the smell of distant rain that would never fall. Alaric was inside trying to teach Samuel his letters when a sound from outside made her freeze. It wasn't the silence of the Watcher's approach. It was a cry, a thin, reedy, desperate sound, like a sick kitten. She grabbed the Winchester and moved to the window, peering cautiously through a crack in the shutter. He was there, standing in the open, fully exposed in the merciless sunlight, something he had never done before. He was no longer the stoic, intimidating figure from the ridge. His shoulders were slumped, his face etched with a pain so profound it was terrifying to witness, and in his arms he held a bundle wrapped in animal skins. The crying was coming from the bundle. He looked directly at the cabin, directly at her window. It wasn't a threat, it was a plea. His obsidian eyes, usually so cold and unreadable, were filled with a desperate, frantic light. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. Alaric's mind raced. Was this a trick, a Trojan horse, a way to get inside her cabin? Her hand tightened on the rifle. Every instinct, every warning she had ever received screamed at her to stay inside, to aim the gun and be ready to fire. But the sound of that cry, it was the cry of an infant, a baby. He stopped about 30 feet from her door, as if sensing he could come no closer. He held out the bundle, his powerful arms trembling with the effort. He said something in his own tongue, the words guttural and pleading. Then he switched to his broken English. "Help!" He rasped the single word, a shard of glass in his throat. "Please, help!" Alaric looked from his agonized face to the crying bundle, and then through the cabin to her own son, who was watching her with wide, fearful eyes. Her fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in her stomach. But beneath it, another instinct was stirring, the one that had made her a mother. It was a force more powerful than fear, more elemental than prejudice. Against all reason, against every fibre of her being that screamed in protest, she unbarred the door and stepped outside, leaving the rifle just inside the threshold. The sun was blinding. The watcher stood before her, a titan of a man brought to his knees by the wailing of a tiny baby. She walked toward him slowly, her hands held open and empty to show she was unarmed. As she got closer, she could see the infant's face. It was tiny, its skin a dusky brown, stretched taut over delicate bones. It was slick with fever sweat, its breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Its eyes were squeezed shut in pain. It was dying. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The Apache's composure finally broke. A tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. "My son," he said, his voice cracking. "His mother. She walked the ghost trail at his birth. 2 moons passed. He will not take the goat's milk. He withers. The shaman's herbs do nothing. He burns with the fire sickness." The pieces fell into place with a sickening thud. His wife was dead. Dead in childbirth. This tiny, struggling life was all he had left of her. And then his terrible words from that first day came back to her. But now they had a new, horrifying context. "I can smell you're fertile." He hadn't been looking for a victim. He hadn't been looking for a conquest. He had been a grieving widower, a desperate father with a dying child, searching for the one thing he believed could save him. He was looking for a mother. He had smelled life on her, the lingering scent of motherhood of a body that had successfully brought a child into the world and nourished him. It wasn't a predator's assessment. It was the desperate diagnosis of a man who had lost everything. He looked at her, his pride stripped away, leaving only raw, pleading desperation. "You are strong," he whispered. "Your son. He is strong. You have the mother's milk, the life. My son, he dies." He was wrong, of course. Samuel had weaned long ago. Her milk was gone. But what he saw in her wasn't just biology. It was a spirit of survival, the aura of a woman who had kept her own child alive against all odds in this God-forsaken land. Alaric looked at the sick baby, its tiny chest rattling with each breath, and she saw not an Apache, not the child of an enemy, but simply a baby. A child in need. She thought of the fever that had taken her Thomas, the helplessness she had felt, watching him burn from the inside out. Her fear and hatred, which had been her constant companions for weeks, evaporated under the heat of a mother's compassion. In that moment, he was not the watcher, not the savage. He was a father, and he was terrified. And she, God help her, was the only person in the world he could turn to. "Bring him inside," Alaric said, her voice clear and steady. "Lay him on the table, quickly." The inside of the cabin, which had always felt like a cramped, dark box, now became a sanctuary and a sick room. The Apache, whose name she learned was Nantin, meaning he who sees, laid his son on the rough-hewn wooden table. Alaric gently unwrapped the skins. The baby boy was even smaller and more fragile than she had imagined. His skin was hot to the touch, and he was frighteningly dehydrated. "Samuel, fetch me the clean rags from the chest and a bowl of water," she commanded, her voice taking on an authority she didn't know she possessed. "Not from the drinking barrel, the washing barrel." Samuel, who had been watching in silent, wide-eyed awe, scurried to obey. He was afraid of the imposing warrior who now stood in his home, but he was more afraid of the urgent, focused tone in his mother's voice. Alaric went to work, drawing on fragments of knowledge from her mother and the harsh lessons of frontier life. She began to tend to the child. She dipped the rags in cool water and began to bathe his tiny body, trying to bring the fever down. He was pitifully thin, his ribs starkly visible beneath his skin. Nantin stood by the wall, his arms crossed, watching her every move. His stillness was absolute, but it was the stillness of a coiled spring, a predator forced into a state of utter vulnerability. He was trusting his entire world, his legacy, the last piece of his dead wife, to a white woman, an enemy by every law of his people and hers. The tension in the small room was thick enough to taste. "I need to get liquids into him," Alaric said more to herself than to him. "He won't live if we can't." She remembered the pouch of herbs he had left her. She fetched it, sniffing the contents. One of them had a sharp, minty smell she vaguely recognized. She crushed a few leaves and steeped them in a little warm water, creating a weak, fragrant tea. Using the corner of a rag as a wick, she patiently squeezed drops of the liquid into the corner of the baby's mouth. At first he didn't respond, then a tiny flicker of a swallowing reflex. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. For hours they worked in a state of unspoken partnership. Alaric tended to the child, her movements gentle and efficient. Nantin stood guard his presence, a silent promise of both protection and threat. Samuel, after his initial fear, became a quiet helper, fetching water and watching with a child's unfiltered curiosity. He seemed to understand on a primal level that this was an act of saving, not of war. As dusk fell, the baby's fever began to recede. His breathing, while still shallow, grew more regular. He finally fell into a true sleep, not the restless, fevered tossing of before. Alaric slumped into a chair, her body aching with exhaustion. She looked at Nantin, whose face was illuminated by the soft glow of the oil lamp. The hard warrior's mask had softened, replaced by a profound, weary gratitude. "He will live," Nantin asked, the words barely audible. "The fever is down, for now," she said honestly. "He needs to keep taking fluids. He needs nourishment. Something his body can handle." She thought for a moment. "I can make a thin broth from the last of the jerky." He simply nodded his eyes, never leaving his son. That night, a strange and dangerous domesticity settled over the cabin. Nantin sat on the floor, his back against the wall, watching his son sleep on a pallet of blankets Alaric had made. She and Samuel ate their meager meal of corn mush in silence. Later, as she lay on her own cot, the Winchester by her side, she was acutely aware of the Apache warrior sitting mere feet away. There was an enemy in her house, yet she had never felt safer from the dangers of the wilderness. The greatest danger, she was beginning to understand, was not him. The next day, Nantin left at dawn and returned by mid-morning with a young deer slung over his shoulders. He butchered it with practiced skill outside the cabin, leaving the best cuts of meat for her and Samuel. It was payment and a promise. While she cared for his son, he would provide for hers. And so the alliance was forged. Days blurred into a routine. Alaric cared for the infant who she learned was named Cheveo, meaning spirit warrior. She slowly nursed him back from the brink, using broth's weak herbal teas and a fierce maternal determination. Nantin, in turn, became their provider and protector. He hunted for them, his silent gifts of meat and edible plants appearing each day. He reinforced the cabin's crumbling chimney, his strong hands working with a craftsman's precision. He taught Samuel how to track a lizard in the dust, and how to identify the call of a hawk. They spoke little, their communication, a blend of gestures, his broken English, and her few learned Apache words. But a deep, powerful understanding grew in the silence between them. It was a bond forged in shared desperation and the primal, universal love for a child. Alaric knew the precariousness of their situation. She was consorting with the enemy. If anyone from Redemption were to see this, she would be branded a traitor, or worse. She was living on a knife's edge. Her fears were realized a week later. Jacob, one of Silas Croft's ranch hands, was tracking a stray steer when his path took him close to the Hayes homestead. Hidden in a thicket of mesquite, he saw an unbelievable sight: the Hayes widow standing in her doorway, handing a bundle of baby to a tall, bare-chested Apache warrior. He saw the warrior nod to her, a look of respect on his face, before turning and disappearing into the rocks. Jacob stared, his mind reeling. He wasn't just consorting with the enemy. She was nursing their young. He spurred his horse and galloped back toward the ranch, his mind alight with the scandalous, incendiary news. Silas Croft was going to be very interested to hear this. The excuse he needed to seize the Hayes property had just been handed to him on a silver platter. The news Jacob brought back was gasoline on the fire of Silas Croft's ambition. He didn't just want Alaric's land anymore, he wanted to make an example of her. A woman siding with an Apache was a threat to the natural order, a betrayal of her own kind. It was the perfect pretext. Croft rode into Redemption that afternoon, his face a mask of righteous fury. He gathered a crowd outside the saloon, his powerful voice ringing through the dusty street. "Our women and children ain't safe," he boomed, pointing in the direction of Alaric's homestead. "While we work and we toil, the Hayes widow has been consorting with the very savages that raid our homes. Jacob here saw it with his own eyes. She's harboring one of them, nursing their spawn. She has chosen her side, and it is not with us. Fear and prejudice always simmering just below the surface in Redemption boiled over. The men, fueled by cheap whiskey and Croft's inflammatory words, became a mob. They saw Alaric not as a desperate widow, but as a turncoat, a squaw lover, whose actions endangered them all. Sheriff Miller tried to intervene, but he was shouted down. "This ain't official business, Miller," a man yelled. "This is a matter of survival." Croft's men, a dozen hard-faced cowboys with rifles, formed the core of the posse. Another 10 or so townsmen, swept up in the hysteria, joined them. They were no longer men. They were a righteous hammer, and Alaric Hayes was the nail. Nan Tin had been teaching Samuel how to carve a small wooden bird when he suddenly froze. He lifted his head, his nostrils flaring like a deer sensing a wolf on the wind. He looked to the east toward the town. "Riders," he said, his voice a low growl. "Many. Coming fast." Alaric's blood ran cold. "Croft," she breathed. There was no time for questions. Nan Tin's calm warrior's focus descended. "Take your son. Go to the cabin. Bar the door. Stay away from the window." He grabbed the bow and quiver of arrows he had crafted in the preceding days. "They will not enter." Alaric herded a terrified Samuel into the cabin, her hands shaking as she dropped the heavy bar across the door. She grabbed the Winchester, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She peered through a small crack in the wall. The posse was a cloud of dust on the horizon, growing larger by the second. Nan Tin had disappeared. He had simply vanished into the rocks and scrub that surrounded the cabin. The riders thundered into the clearing, their horses rearing and snorting. Silas Croft was at their head, his face contorted in a mask of grim satisfaction. "Alaric Hayes," he bellowed, "you have been judged a traitor to your people. Give up the Apache savage you're hiding, and we may yet show you mercy." A terrified silence was his only answer. "Have it your way," Croft sneered. "Burn her out, boys." 2 of his men dismounted with torches, but before they could take 3 steps, an arrow hissed out of the twilight and buried itself in the ground, inches from one man's boot. It was a warning shot. "He's in the rocks," someone yelled, and a volley of panicked rifle fire erupted, the bullets splintering against the stones where they presumed Nantin was hiding. The siege began. It was a chaotic, terrifying affair. The posse used to intimidation and open fights was unprepared for a skilled guerrilla warrior on his own ground. Nantin was a ghost. An arrow would fly from one direction, and when they fired upon the spot, another would come from a completely different angle. He used the landscape, every rock, every ravine, every shadow as a weapon. He never shot to kill, only to wound or to frighten. A man would cry out as an arrow pierced his arm. A horse would scream and bolt as a shaft struck its flank. Inside the cabin, Alaric and Samuel huddled on the floor. With every gunshot, the cabin walls seemed to shudder. Samuel was crying silently, his face buried in his mother's skirt. Alaric held him tight, murmuring reassurances she didn't feel. She was no longer just protecting her son. She was protecting the man outside who was risking his life for them. The world had been reduced to this single desperate point, the 3 of them a tiny island of alliance against the rage of the world. As the sun began to set, casting long bloody shadows across the land, Croft grew more desperate. His posse was spooked, their bravado bleeding away with the light. They were shooting at shadows, their ammunition dwindling. "Damn it, she's in there!" Croft roared in frustration. "Forget the savage! The house! Rush the house!" 3 of his men, bolder or stupider than the rest, charged towards the cabin. "Mama!" Samuel screamed as the heavy thud of their boots grew closer. Alaric's resolve hardened. This was her home. Her son was here. She rose from the floor, cocked the Winchester, and rested its barrel in the firing slot Thomas had built into the wall. She was not a warrior, but she was a mother, and she would fight. She saw a man running for the door, his face a grimace of determination. She took a deep breath, lined up the sights, as Thomas had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, its roar deafening in the small space. The man screamed and fell, clutching a leg shattered at the knee. The other 2 attackers faltered, stunned that the helpless widow was fighting back. In that moment of hesitation, Nantin struck. He burst from the shadows behind them, not with a bow but with a heavy war club. He moved with a speed that was terrifying and beautiful. It was over in seconds. He disabled the other 2 men with swift, brutal, non-lethal blows, leaving them groaning in the dust. He stood over them for a moment, his chest heaving a fierce, protective spirit of the land. He looked at the remaining men of the posse, who were frozen in fear and disbelief, then at the cabin door, a silent acknowledgement to the woman inside. The attack was broken. The remaining men had no stomach for this fight. They began to back away, dragging their wounded. Silas Croft, his face pale with fury and humiliation, stared at Nantin. "This isn't over, you savage," he spat. "And you, woman," he screamed at the cabin, "you'll hang for this." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his posse crumbling and fleeing behind him. The sound of their retreat faded, leaving behind an eerie silence, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded men and the buzzing of flies. The siege was over. They had survived. But Alaric knew Croft was right. It wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The silence that descended after the posse's chaotic retreat was more profound and unsettling than the gunfire it replaced. It was a heavy, listening silence, thick with the metallic tang of spent gunpowder, and the coppery scent of fresh blood soaking into the thirsty earth. Under the indifferent gaze of a rising moon, the clearing around Alaric's cabin was a desolate tableau of violence's aftermath. The abandoned men left behind by their cowardly leader lay like broken dolls in the dust, their moans and whimpers the only sound disturbing the night's new stillness. For a long moment, Alaric remained inside, leaning against the rough-hewn planks of the door, the heavy Winchester still clutched in her hands. The adrenaline that had sharpened her senses into a razor's edge was now draining away, leaving a bone-deep tremor in its wake. She had shot a man. The realization wasn't one of triumph, but of horror. She had crossed a line, and she could feel the woman she used to be, the gentle wife from Ohio, the grieving widow, receding into the past, becoming a ghost. In her place was someone harder, someone forged in fear and fury. When she finally found the strength to move, she unbarred the door and stepped out into the cool night air. Samuel, a silent shadow, clung to her skirts, his eyes wide with a trauma he was too young to comprehend. Her gaze fell upon Nantin. He was not celebrating his victory. He was moving with a grim purpose among the wounded men he had felled. He knelt beside the man whose leg Alaric's bullet had shattered, pulling a knife not to finish him, but to slit the man's pant leg to assess the damage. With strips of cloth torn from the man's own shirt, he fashioned a crude but effective tourniquet, his movements economical and devoid of any discernible emotion. Alaric watched, mesmerized by the strange dichotomy. His hands, which had wielded a war club with devastating force only moments before, were now methodical and precise. He showed no malice, no triumph. It was the detached, practical work of a man who understood the fundamental rules of survival. A defeated enemy was no longer a threat, merely a problem to be managed. The men who had come to burn her home and kill him were now recipients of his dispassionate mercy. The irony was a bitter pill. The savage was demonstrating an honor that the civilized mob had proven they completely lacked. He finished his work and rose, turning to face her in the silvery moonlight. The fierceness of battle had drained from his face, leaving behind a grave solemnity that seemed as ancient as the rocks around them. "They will return," he said. The words were flat, a statement of inevitable truth. "Yes," Alaric whispered, her voice hoarse. "This time Croft won't bring a mob. He'll bring the law, or what he can twist into its shape. He'll tell them we ambushed them, that we murdered these men." "They are not dead," Nantin stated, his gaze sweeping over the groaning figures. "But their words will be poison against you. Their lies will have the weight of truth in your town." He took a step closer, his obsidian eyes holding a deep, painful respect that she felt more keenly than any pity. "You fought." He said the words a simple acknowledgement of the warrior he had seen emerge from within her. "I fought for my son." She replied the words a shield for the more complicated truth. She had fought for Samuel, yes, but she had also fought for this strange, unspoken pact. She had fought for the man who saw her not as a widow or a squaw, but as a fellow survivor. A silent understanding passed between them, a bond sealed in gunpowder and blood. They had won this battle, but the war for her life here was irrevocably lost. She could never go back to redemption, never trade at the general store, never be seen as anything other than the Apache witch they would now call her. This homestead, bought with her and Thomas's sweat and dreams, was now nothing more than a cage waiting to be sprung. "You must go," Nantin said, his voice urgent but low, "before the sun rises. The moon is bright enough to guide you for a time. Take your son and go west, toward the mountains where the land hides a trail. Do not follow the main roads." "Go where?" The question was a ragged tear in the fabric of the night, the cry of a soul pushed beyond the edge. "We have nothing. This land, this cabin, it was all we had. They will hunt us." Without a word, Nantin walked to the horse that belonged to the man she had shot, a sturdy-looking roan that stood placidly, its reins trailing in the dust. From a leather saddlebag, he pulled a small, heavy pouch that jingled with the unmistakable sound of coins. He took the horse's reins, leading it over to her. He pressed the pouch and a full canteen into her hands. The man with the cold eyes coughed. Nantin said, his broken English sharp with certainty. "His poison has spread too far. This place, it is a grave for you now, if you stay. This," he gestured to the horse and the pouch, "is their payment. For the bullets, for the lies. You are not a thief. You are a survivor, taking what is owed." Alaric looked down at the pouch, its weight in her palm feeling both like a salvation and a damnation. It was enough money to start over somewhere somehow. It was also the currency of her new life as a fugitive. She was accepting the spoils of war, becoming the very thing her old life would have condemned. "And you?" she asked, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "Where will you go?" A flicker of something ancient and sad crossed his face. "My people are scattered like leaves in the wind. My son Cheveo is the last of my blood. I will take him north to the high country, a place of thin air and old gods where the white man does not go. He is strong now." Nantin looked at her, his gratitude a palpable force. "He is strong because you did not let him die." Their farewell was not one of embraces or promises. Their worlds were too different, their paths too divergent. He was a warrior, returning to the wilderness that was his birthright. She was an exile being cast into it. He gently touched his own chest with his fingertips, then extended his hand toward her palm open. It was a gesture of profound respect, a bridge of understanding across an impassable gulf. Numbly, Alaric went back inside the cabin. She gathered only what mattered: a thick wool blanket, her husband's worn book of letters, and a small tin of matches. Everything else was a part of a life that no longer existed. She led Samuel to the horse, his small face pale and streaked with tears, and lifted him into the saddle. He was quiet, his small body rigid with shock. She climbed up behind him, settling into the worn leather the rifle laid across her lap. She looked back one last time at the bullet-scarred cabin, a tombstone for her dreams. Then she looked at Nantin. He stood alone in the center of the clearing, a solitary, timeless figure against the vast, uncaring landscape. The infant Cheveo was strapped securely to his back, a sleeping bundle, who was the cause of it all. Their eyes met, and, in that final silent communion, an entire unwritten history passed between them. It was a look of shared battle of a debt acknowledged and a life repaid. It held the profound grief of their circumstances and a fierce, unyielding respect that defied the hatred of their respective peoples. He was the savage who had saved her. She was the civilized woman who had understood him. With a final, almost imperceptible nod, Alaric Hayes turned the horse west. She did not look back again. She rode toward the dark, jagged line of the mountains, a fugitive and an outcast her son held tight against her, and an outlaw's gold in her pocket. She rode into a future as vast and unknown as the desert itself, leaving her old name and her old life to be buried in the dust of the homestead, a place where its story would be twisted into a dark local legend of the Apache witch, a cautionary tale that never once touched the impossible, heartbreaking truth. The story of Alaric Hayes and Nantin doesn't have a happy ending, because the Wild West rarely offered them. It was a story of survival, written in a language of desperation that transcended race and prejudice. She wasn't a traitor, and he wasn't a savage. They were two parents caught in the jaws of a brutal world who forged a bond the so-called civilized society around them could never understand. Their story is a powerful reminder that history is never as simple as the stories we're told. It's messy, it's complicated, and it's deeply, profoundly human. If this forgotten piece of history moved you, if it made you question the lines we draw between us and them, then please help us keep these stories alive. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who appreciates a story with depth, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales from the dusty pages of the past. Let us know in the comments below, what would you have done in Alaric's place? Thank you for listening.